Right after this episode ended, I hopped online and I typed up some of my first impressions and observations of this episode. And in that post, I was speaking about the grave dug out in the desert and the transition to Jean lying in bed and pondering what that might mean, right? So it seems a little bit too on the nose that this is foreshadowing of the character actually dying, and was instead thinking of what it might mean symbolically. So the death of Jean, perhaps, and or that he has made his bed and he must lie in it, so to speak. So the or he dug his own grave, you know. So I also mentioned, though, at any rate, that I see Jimmy here and that he's reverted back to his old ways. And then in the comments, a couple of you got me thinking about this a little bit more deeply. And certainly as I rewatched the episode, more things occurred to me. Dan Carpentieri said, when you said I see Slip and Jimmy here and he's reverted back to his old ways, I sort of disagree, and here's why. I think he's far worse. This is a side of Jimmy Saul Jean we've never seen before. He's completely without any type of remorse and or empathy. And thanks for that comment, Dan, because you helped plant a seed that has since then bloomed into something else. And Hagonology also wrote that I don't know what to expect going forward, but the title was warranted. Saul's a bleeping monster left my lips at one point, and it was awesome. And a few other people in the comments remarked on the monstrosity of this character in this episode. And as I rewatched this episode, I was thinking of that monstrosity and this evolution to what we see, or devolution as the case may be. And I started to pick up on a couple of references.
What the hell is this? It's like James Whale's traveling roadshow in here.
Okay, so if you cook the blue stuff, then that means you're Igor, and that makes you your iceberg.
You should try one of these. You walk like Frankenstein after he was probed by aliens. You see an amateur, I see 170 pounds of clay ready to be molded.
James Whale is a director who is probably best known for directing 1931's Frankenstein. And then, of course, you hear the reference to Igor, right? Saul calls Jesse Igor when he's trying to piece together what their role is and what each of their role is in the operation. And then in the later scene with Mike in his office, he refers to Mike as Frankenstein. Of course, in the story Frankenstein, Viktor Frankenstein is the mad scientist and the monster is Frankenstein's monster. But colloquially in popular culture, we often refer to the monster himself as Frankenstein. So I'm sure Jimmy Saul knows that, but the monster of Frankenstein. And then in that last clip, the idea of molding 170 pounds of clay made me think of the story of the Golem. And the Golem, like Frankenstein, is a autochthonous creature. So they are creatures that are made of man, of other materials, of earthly materials, that they're, in other words, they're not made by God. And in the case of Frankenstein, putting together the many parts of different bodies to create one being started making me think of all of the different identities of this character, Jimmy Jean Saul. So Dan's comment was playing in my head as I was rewatching this episode, and how this isn't one of those iterations that we've seen before. It is an amalgamation of those iterations, and that all of these characters, Jean, Jimmy, Saul, are put together to create this character that we now see before us, who is monstrous. And of course, we also see that he's going by his old name of Victor. So another nod perhaps to Frankenstein. Viktor Frankenstein. Now, I don't think that was the intention when Tom Schnauz sat down to write this episode. I think it's just a really cool coincidence. It may have also occurred to him since he peppered in so many Frankenstein references in this episode that, of course, Viktor Frankenstein. But Viktor is already a name that's been established in the series. For example, in season 2, episode 1, Switch, we see Jimmy assume that identity when he's with Kim, who goes by Giselle St. Clair, and they con Ken wins into buying them that bottle of Zafiro Añejo. So that all being said, right, this isn't like a one for one. You can't say that the events of this episode follow the story of Frankenstein exactly, but I do think it is a useful lens for understanding this character and where he is, and to really highlight the monstrosity of his actions. But of course, he is a man. He is a person of flesh and blood. He is not an actual monster that someone put together, but he is the sum of all his parts, right? He is the sum of all of these parts, and it's the behavior is monstrous, of course, but men are subject to laws, right? And in the story of Frankenstein, Victor is horrified by his creation and ultimately rejects the monster. And the monster at first is not monstrous, right? He's curious. He wants to learn. He wants to be a part of the world. He learns how to speak by studying a family. And he teaches himself how to read when he finds some books. So Jimmy, like Frankenstein's monster, teaches himself. So the monster teaches himself how to read when he finds some books in the woods. And we see something similar happen with Jimmy at HHM. He teaches himself law. We see him walk into the law library and he gets himself enrolled in school. He goes to law school and he's trying to become a part of that world, that HHM legal world. And ultimately, his brother rejects him. And there is a little bit of a parallel between a scene we see here and a past scene when Jimmy first tells Chuck, the news that he's a lawyer, he passed the bar, and he goes and asks if he could work at HHM, and Chuck's like, oh, I'll have to confer with the other partners. Then we get that scene where they're in the mailroom. Jimmy, Kim, and the other mailroom employees are celebrating in the mailroom when Howard walks in. And then everyone leaves and the door shuts, and we don't actually get to hear the dialogue, but the dialogue isn't really important in that scene. We see how crestfallen Jimmy is. Something similar happens in this episode. So Gene calls Kim, and we don't actually get to hear the conversation. And I should probably say calls Kim's place of business, because it's not confirmed that he's actually speaking to her. I know there's isolated audio out there where it certainly seems like he is speaking to Kim, but we'll have to wait and see in the next episode, perhaps. But anyway, those two scenes reminded me of each other, right? So like we are on the outside, we don't actually get to hear the dialogue that is being spoken, but again, the focus, the emphasis is on Gene's reaction here, and this deep sense of hurt and rejection. His brother, who he tried to impress, ultimately rejected him. And when Kim walks out on him in 609, that's also a form of rejection. Now, this is not to say that those characters were in the wrong. That's not what I'm saying at all. This isn't a question of right or wrong or, morals here, but the end result, how this character, Gene Saul, feels about this sense of rejection. And in the story of Frankenstein, the monster becomes attached to this family, this poor family that he discovers, and he collects firewood for them and leaves it outside. Now, they're not aware of his existence, but this is how he learns how to speak, by studying them discreetly. And then one day he enters into the home, and there is a blind man there, and the blind man, of course, cannot see the monster before him, and they're chatting. And when the family comes home, though, they freak out, right? They're scared. They see this monster standing there, and they flee. They're terrified. And the creature is deeply wounded by this utter sense of rejection when he was really trying to do something kind and do something nice, and he is not the monster that everyone thought he really was. But of course, it's something of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So he goes and tries to find Viktor, right? So even though like he's mad at Viktor for abandoning him, he thinks that Viktor is the only one who can save him, who can actually help him. So again, I think thinking about the story of Frankenstein and the parallels to Jimmy Saul Gene's storyline helps us helps give some context to how he might be feeling. So this utter sense of rejection, even when he tries to do the right thing. Chuck always tells him, "You're slipping, Jimmy. You can never change." And this can be debated ad infinitum. Like, would he have become Saul? Would he have become Gene had it not been for Chuck, Walter White, Kim, or any of these other influences in his life? And I certainly hesitate from saying like any other character is responsible for his creation, but they certainly influenced him as he influences others, right? So this is you can look at Chuck and Jimmy's relationship, for example, and look at how they each influence the other and how they each help shape the other. And the same thing very much so with Jimmy and Kim. And Kim recognizes it when she says that they are poisoned together. So this phone call with perhaps Kim, where we see such pain, right? Such unadulterated rage. I think that's Jimmy's utter sense of rejection and frustration. And in many ways, Kim helped to craft Saul Goodman. And I mentioned this in several of my breakdowns, like going back to certainly to Carrot and Stick. I even used the phrase mutually assured destruction and mutually assured creation. So it was interesting to hear that line, mutually assured destruction, said in the previous episode when Gene is talking to Jeff and Buddy. But they kind of create each other. And even in my breakdown of Wine and Roses, looking at that mural of Jupiter and Minerva, I was thinking of I think the story of Jupiter and Minerva, or Zeus and Athena, because they're the same, Greek and Roman, was a useful way of thinking about Jim and Kimmy, right? So Athena springs fully formed from Zeus's head, and in a way, we see Giselle, or this iteration of Kim that we see when she's with Jimmy, sort of spring from Slippin' Jimmy. And we see how Kim helps to shape this persona or this identity of Saul Goodman. And then, of course, after she leaves is when he fully assumes that identity. So again, this is not to lay blame at Kim's feet for what happened. I don't think anything is that black and white in this series, except for, of course, the black and white footage we see of Gene. But I don't think we should take that as any sort of literal commentary on how like this is a binary good or evil. I think there's a lot of gray area in there, and all of these characters are human. They're complex. They have their good and their bad. So in the story of Frankenstein, Viktor Frankenstein, while reflecting on his life, realizes that everybody's death is ultimately his fault, because he did not take responsibility for the monster that he created. And he is left with nothing but sadness and despair at the end. Now, I think this, again, is a very useful way of thinking about this character, Saul Gene Jimmy. So he is both creator and, the sum of his parts as well. So he's sort of both Viktor Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. And in the story, he says, "Now I see, although this is not why I renounce my right to wish his death. No, not after price I paid for his revenge. Perhaps I did deserve his hatred, but my loved ones did not deserve to die. For that reason, I regret dying while he lives." And his last words are, Walton, motivated by madness, I created a rational being, and with that came the responsibility for his happiness and well-being, which I did not fulfill. And this, I think, and this reminds me of Ozymandias. So in Ozymandias, once he becomes the king that he wanted to be, he realizes ultimately that it's not what he expected, and all that is left is loneliness and despair. He has nothing. So in this episode, when Jean is talking to Francesca, she reports that there's no money left, right? That the feds found everything, all of his shell companies and his tigerfish money down in the islands, which tigerfish is a nod to the film Ice Station Zebra. So he's left with nothing. He has no money. He has no Kim. And in the poem Ozymandias, it says, my name is Ozymandias, king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So Ozymandias, like Viktor Frankenstein, they both achieved their goals. But it turned out not to be what they actually really wanted, and they're left with nothing beyond despair. And I think there's another little nod to Ozymandias in this episode in the RV.
Hey, are we going to try that again? Because, or are they going to find us, buried in a sandstorm 1,000 years from now? Just please.
So another interesting maybe tidbit to note here is that Ozymandias, of course, is a poem written by Percy Shelley, and Frankenstein was written by his wife, Mary Shelley. And this idea of Kim and Jimmy being responsible for these creations of art, I think, is an interesting one to ponder. Now, this idea of self-creation and not getting what you want, again, I spoke about this a little bit in my breakdown of Hit and Run, and how I kind of read that as like the Emperor's New Clothes. We hear the Emperor's Concerto playing in Howard's car when it's getting parked by the valet at Fork before Huel steals the keys, and then they're able to make a copy of the key. And then, of course, in that was the previous episode before Hit and Run. And then in Hit and Run itself, we see that Jimmy has put on these new clothes. He thinks he's invisible. Something somewhat like the story of the Emperor in The Emperor's New Clothes. And then, of course, we see that Jimmy and Kim's plan goes according to plan. Howard is discredited. The Sandpiper case settles. And but they're not happy in the end because of everything that happens as a consequence of it. So like Ozymandias, like Viktor Frankenstein, they are not happy, right? They're left with nothing but despair. So could it perhaps be that Jean reaches out to Kim because he feels that she's the only one that can help him? And I think that there might actually be some truth there, that she's the only one that could possibly help him. Now, this is again not to say that she is responsible for him, but in terms of the literary reading here, being responsible for your creation, she helped create this mess. And of course, she thought by walking away, she was doing the right thing. And I believe Kim walked away because she wanted to put an end to it. And, but it was in a way, in a sense, at least from Jimmy's point of view, abandonment and rejection. And again, this is not to say that Kim is responsible for what happens to Saul and then ultimately Jean. Again, this is these are people. This is not like a monster that was fashioned together from body parts. It's just another way of reading this story, to help us understand the character's perspective. So how does Jimmy Saul feel about everything? He feels abandoned and he's hurt. So this was originally going to be my entire breakdown of this episode, but I had so much to say in just this one video that I'm going to make this a separate video where this will just be about the story of the modern Prometheus. And I'll do a breakdown, a more comprehensive breakdown of the entire episode, and I'll try to get that up as soon as I can. So as always, thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up, and I will catch you all in the next one. Bye. Light, feeling, and sense will pass away, and in this condition I must find my happiness. Some years ago, when the images which this world affords first opened upon me, when I felt the cheering warmth of summer and heard the rustling of the leaves and the warbling of the birds, and these were all to me, I should have wept to die. Now it is my only consolation. Polluted by crimes and torn by the bitterest remorse, where can I find rest but in death? Farewell, I leave you, and in you the last of humankind whom those eyes will ever behold. Farewell, Frankenstein. If thou wert yet alive and yet cherished a desire of revenge against me, it would be better satiated in my life than in my destruction. But it was not so. Thou didst seek my extinction, that I might not cause greater wretchedness. And if yet, in some mode unknown to me, thou hadst not ceased to think and feel, thou wouldst not desire against me a vengeance greater than that which I feel. Blasted as thou wert, my agony was still superior to thine, for the bitter sting of remorse will not cease to rankle in my wounds until death shall close them forever. But soon, he cried with sad and solemn enthusiasm, I shall die, and what I now feel be no longer felt. Soon those burning miseries will be extinct. I shall ascend my funeral pile triumphantly and exult in the agony of the torturing flames. The light of that conflagration will fade away. My ashes will be swept into the sea by the winds. My spirit will sleep in peace, or if it thinks, it will not surely think thus. Farewell. He sprang from the cabin window as he said this upon the ice raft which lay close to the vessel. He was soon borne away by the waves and lost in the darkness and distance.